This is American Government on Friday, September 4th, 2020. Um, this is the third lecture in our section on the founding. As I mentioned on Wednesday, we covered the Constitutional Convention and the construction of the Constitution. Today, we'll turn to two famous essays, critical essays explaining what I would call the theory of the Constitution or its view of human nature. This is Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. I'll give an overall background to the Federalist Papers in a minute, and then we'll turn to a discussion of the essays themselves. On Monday, we'll turn to our fourth session on the founding. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, when I teach American government, I typically don't teach current events. I may mention them by way of making an example or clarifying an aspect of our institutions or something, or our principles. But I've sort of made an exception this semester because of the remarkable events in our nation that have occurred in the last couple of months. And in particular, as I'll mention on Monday, the New York Times undertook in 2019 a series of essays called the 1619 Project, which the intention of which was to reevaluate the place of slavery and race in American life in general, and in the founding in particular. So, and I've sent some readings out on that, and we'll turn to that issue on Monday. On Wednesday, I've allotted one more discussion of the founding for summary purposes, and it might be good for you to send your questions if you haven't raised them in the Zoom sessions to me so I can address them in my video lecture. And the exam will be next Friday, the first midterm, and it will cover the material up through now. So let's turn to the Federalist Papers. So again, we saw how the framers constructed the Constitution, how they weighed different alternatives, and how they had drawn from their experience, both as practical politicians and statesmen themselves. Almost all of them were. Many of them were well educated and knew history very well, especially the leading thinkers like Madison and Hamilton, etc. John Adams, although John Adams was not at the Constitutional Convention. And I think it's an important point that they were not political philosophers on the level of a Plato or Aristotle or Geoffrey Bulworthy, just kidding, or Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, but they were conversant with the great philosophers, especially the modern philosophers, which had certainly informed the new understanding of human beings as possessing human rights that's embodied in the Declaration. And also, don't forget the great modern philosophers like Hobbes and Locke, David Hume, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, etc. They were political philosophers. They not only embodied a new kind of philosophy of nature and a new philosophy of humanity, they also specifically promulgated certain institutional teachings. And as we'll see, the preeminent one that is reflected in the teachings of John Locke and Baron de Montesquieu is the separation of powers and checks and balances. I should say separation of powers. We'll see that the framers in some ways added the unique feature of checks and balances. And I would say that because they were moved by or within the influence of the new wave of modern political philosophy of the Enlightenment, and also were reflective statesmen and practical politicians, when they constructed the institutions embodied in the Constitution, and then when they turned to explain them to the nation in the press of the time, especially the Federalist Papers, I would say that encouraged by the Declaration, the framers thought a good deal about human nature. And as we'll see, there is a kind of a consistent view of human nature that undergirds the institutions of the Constitution and informs the framers' thought. Again, remember the Declaration of Independence, our founding document, encourages us to think about human nature. There's a doctrine of human nature, as we saw in it. And as you'll see, there's a kind of a doctrine of human nature in the Constitution. So, when the Constitution was finished on September 17th, 1787, it was sent back to Congress, who had commissioned the convention, and then sent out to the states to begin the ratification procedure as laid out in Article 7. And very quickly, the states organized for that purpose. And there ensued what's called the Ratification Period from late 1787 to June of 1788, when the ninth state ratified the Constitution according to Article 7. And as many historians have pointed out, the Constitution was widely disseminated in print. It was widely discussed. It was perhaps, according to Amar Reed, a prominent constitutional scholar, the ratification of the Constitution was probably the most democratic, open, and widely discussed political founding in the history of the human race, at least up to that time. So, both the defenders of the Constitution and the critics of the Constitution took to the newspapers, and a flurry of really remarkable writing ensued, of various quality, some really quite top-notch writing, and preeminent them, of course, is the Federalist Papers. I explained that in New York, where Hamilton was from, the Constitution's the chance of being ratified or being rejected was very close, and in fact, the final ratification vote was won by 3 votes. Hamilton, by the way, who also was in the Articles of Confederation Congress, like Madison, had attended the Annapolis Convention, had attended the convention, helped to draft the Constitution, and helped to write the Federalist Papers, was also in the Ratification Convention in New York, and repeated the remarkable feats of rhetoric and endurance that he displayed in the Constitutional Convention. So, in order to support the Constitution, he enlisted James Madison and John Jay, who was probably one of our most prominent diplomats at that time, to compose 85 essays on the Constitution. And they were published under the common pseudonym or pen name Publius. During the ratification struggle, and in fact, in many periods in American history, writers have often written under a pen name, and the names that they picked tended to be names from the democratic past of Greece or the republican past of Rome. In this case, they assumed the pen name of Publius. And scholars have debated for 2 centuries who wrote which papers. The authors themselves claimed during their lives about 2/3 of the essays were written by Hamilton, about 1/3 by Madison, including the 2 important ones that we're reading today, and about 5 by John Jay. And computer analysis and sophisticated word count and those kinds of tests have actually confirmed that. So, as I mentioned, these essays were quickly collected, and it's not certain how much influence they actually had on New York, but they were influential throughout the rest of the states, and have been the preeminent source of commentary on the Constitution, in addition to the notes of the convention itself that Madison took and were subsequently published 50 years afterwards. So, in some ways, the Federalist Papers are considered the most authoritative commentary on the Constitution, widely employed. If you paid attention to the news and during the impeachment issue this last year, both sides of the impeachment question took to the Federalist Papers to justify their positions. So, what I want to do is actually give you a little bit of an introductory framework, an outline, how the papers, their papers are very well organized and often remarkably well structured internally. In all good essays, in all good collections of essays, there is, of course, an introduction and a conclusion. And Federalist number 1 is the introduction that lays out the issues. It makes the argument that it seems to have been left up to the American people, almost providentially, to decide the question of whether human communities are really capable of determining their government by free discussion. You may or may not agree with that self-discussion, but in it he lays out the rest of the structure of the papers, and then 85 is the concluding essay. In the middle, these are the topics and roughly the essays that cover them. From Federalist 2 to 14, the purposes, desirability, and advantages of a strong union are laid out. Now, you could say that all Americans at that time wanted the country to remain united and would have considered its disunification or its falling apart a tragedy or a betrayal of promise of the revolution. And what Madison and Hamilton do, they both authored essays in this section. They try to not only say that union is good, which most Americans would have agreed with, but what the purposes of a strong union were. And for instance, later we'll come back to Federalist 11, in which Hamilton argues that a strong union is favorable for commerce and prosperity and military strength. Federalist 10, which you may have figured out by now, is the essay that comes immediately before Federalist 11, makes the argument that a strong union is useful for combating the problem of faction. And I'll explain what that means in the context of the argument when we come back to it. The next section in the Federalist Papers, after laying out the goods of union, is to lay before the New Yorkers and the American public the defects of the Articles of Confederation, from essays 15 through 22. And the main point here is that America is a nation. The problem with the Articles is it's a confederation, a union of sovereign states. And the argument there is such an institutional arrangement will never be sufficient to securing and preserving the union and obtaining the goods as a nation. If you want a nation, you need a national government. That's the argument of that section. The next section, which occupies a long part, is from Essay 23 to Essay 38, the necessity of the powers of the new Constitution. As the Constitution went out and was disseminated, there were all kinds of criticisms, as you might have supposed, for such a novel form of government or proposal. Some argued that the presidency was too strong, as we saw that there was no Bill of Rights. And generally speaking, most of the critics agreed that the national government had too many powers. Even if the Articles of Confederation had too few powers, people were concerned that such a strong government might abuse those powers. Hamilton tries in this section then to say, if you want to have a national government, these are the kinds of powers you need. Those are the kinds of powers which are given to the Constitution. In Federalist 39 to 46, Hamilton and Madison deal with a specific charge made against the new Constitution, the proposed Constitution, that it would be neither Republican, and we will discuss the meaning of that term today, nor Federalist. By that, the critics of the Constitution meant that it may have the appearance of a popular government, to quote Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address, of the people, by the people, for the people, but it was a sham. Very quickly, or over time, the popular dimensions of the Constitution would give rise to probably some kind of executive tyranny, or would somehow lose its rootedness in the will of the people. The other charge was that, and this was the term that was used, that the Constitution was consolidationist. By that, its critics meant that even if the states are preserved, and they are, although they clearly are no longer sovereign entities, they are semi-sovereign, and we'll discuss that problematic term in a few weeks. And they're represented in the Senate. They have a critical role in the Electoral College, in the ratification process, and have a fair part of the task of governance left to them. The critics of the Constitution argue that over time, the national government would grow stronger and stronger and begin to absorb the states and would eventually consolidate them. and that the states would lose their vitality and function within the political system. So in these papers, primarily Madison is responding and arguing that the institutions of the Constitution are genuinely rooted in popular will and operate by popular will, and the Constitution, although it's not a confederation, it has elements of a confederation, and the states are vital elements. For our purposes, the next section is contains the other Federalist paper that we'll concentrate on today, and that's paper 47 through 51. These essays lay out the theory of the separation of powers and checks and balances. And I'll come back to 47, Federalist 47. We won't read it, but I'll quote from it because it sets the tone and the issues for the succeeding papers. Now, the beginning of Federalist 51 says, "To what expedient shall we finally turn?" And many people might wonder, why would you begin an essay with "to what expedient" or what solution should we turn to finally? It's because Federalist 51 is the last paper in this section. Federalist 47 begins with the question, how do you prevent tyranny? And Federalist 51 answers that question with the separation of powers and checks and balances. So that's a little context. Just quickly then, papers 52 through 51, and in fact the rest of the Federalist papers simply follow the institutions of the national government. 52 through 61 lay out the House of Representatives. 62 through 66 discuss the Senate and explain the construction of the Senate. The papers 67 through 77 lay out the presidency. 78 through 83, the judiciary. So that just goes through the institutions of the national government. Federalist 84 is devoted simply to the question of why the Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights. Because as the Constitution was discussed during the ratification struggle, as we saw, by the way, 3 of the attenders of the Federal Convention, of the Constitutional Convention, refused to sign the Constitution because it possessed no Bill of Rights, among other things. Most of the state constitutions at that time did possess a Bill of Rights, and so Hamilton, in this essay, tries to respond to that. We won't go into those arguments right now. We may probably come back to them later in the course. And then 85, as I mentioned, is the conclusion. So the 2 papers that we're reading today, Federalist 10 is from the section which lays out and tries to make clear the advantages of a strong union, of a strong united country. As you'll see, the topic of Federalist 10 goes far beyond the simple, clear objectives such as national strength or military strength or commercial prosperity. I'll prep you for that argument. In Federalist 10, Madison argues that a strong union, in which will mean in the context of that paper, a huge, diverse national republic, which had never existed before in human history, would be useful for addressing the fundamental defect, or one of the fundamental defects, in all popular governments previous in human history, democracy and republics, and that is the problem of faction. More about that later. Federalist 51, as I mentioned, is from the section on the separation of powers. So as we turn to these 2 specific essays to see what they have to say about human beings and how it's relevant to the Constitution, you'd have to say you could divide the subject of these 2 essays in this way. And we'll turn to 51 first. 51 raises the question, how do you prevent tyranny in government? And you could say that's the preeminent question in some ways, since the Declaration of Independence says that we needed our independence from Britain because the British government had drifted into tyranny. And so Federalist 51 deals with tyranny on the level of institutions. Federalist 10, as you'll see, goes to the question of the potential for tyranny among the people themselves. As we saw last week, when the revolution started, and the states and the people that created the constitutions of the states and the articles primarily thought that the only or the main source of tyranny in government was from the executive branch or from a potentially tyrannical monarch. You'd have to say that they learned during that 11 years, after 1776, that the other institutions of government can be tyrannical too. Thomas Jefferson said in his notes of the state of Virginia, respecting the 153 legislators in Virginia, which ran roughshod over the state constitution and the other branches of government during that period, Jefferson said 153 tyrants is just as bad as one. So not only did their understanding of tyranny expand to include the other institutions of government, the legislature, and even the judiciary, but their understanding had revealed that even the people themselves, the source of governmental power through consent, the people themselves can become tyrannical. Now, once you start thinking about that, you have to go beyond the simple solutions that had dominated the Articles of Confederation, and that's why, in some ways, the American founding is worth repeated study, because in confronting in constructing the institutions of the country, the framers tried to address deep, persistent problems in government. And to give you a heads up, it turns out that the source of tyranny isn't a king or a monarch. It's not even a legislature. And the reason it can be in the people is the source of tyranny itself is human nature. So, as you'll see as we finish this discussion today, it will point back to Diamond's article on the Declaration, the Revolution of Sober Expectations. In some ways, you're going to see that the framers rejected utopianism, rejected the idea that human nature can be perfected or can be reconfigured in such a way that human nature becomes unproblematic. The framers were convinced, as is the New Testament, as is most theological traditions, as most philosophers, that there are elements in human nature that cannot be, dark elements in human nature, that cannot be overcome through social engineering, even a good education, or even a good breakfast. So let's turn to Federalist 51. So, how do you prevent tyranny in the institutions of government? Well, it would be helpful to start with a definition of tyranny, and that's exactly what Madison does in Federalist 47. He quotes Baron de Montesquieu, the great French political theorist, who in 1733 published his great work, The Spirit of Laws. Now, the source of the doctrine of separation of powers was actually the thinker John Locke in the Second Treatise of Government in 1688. Locke begins the idea that all well-constructed government has to be divided into branches and essentially consists of three powers or functions: legislative, executive, and when I teach the Second Treatise of Government, people are surprised to discover that the third power he mentions is not the judiciary. He combines that with the executive, but rather what he calls the federative power, the power to engage in foreign affairs. Montesquieu, about a generation later, who was in some ways perhaps more directly influential on the founders, although Locke was also very influential, reconfigured the three powers of government to be legislative, executive, and judicial. And it's that reconfiguration of separated powers that our institutions followed in this country and that the framers followed in constructing the Constitution. So Montesquieu defines tyranny as, and this is the definition that Madison uses, the concentration of all powers in one set of hands. It's rather like Lord Acton's famous saying from the 1700s, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So once all power collapses into a single body, whether it's a single person or an institution, or even, as you'll see in Federalist 10, even in a majority in a democracy, then you've got tyranny. I've often taught literature. It's part of my scholarly background, and I've enjoyed teaching it over the years. And I've enjoyed teaching Greek tragedy and Shakespearean tragedy. And in some ways, let me just add here, the definition I just gave from Montesquieu, from Madison and Montesquieu, the concentration of all powers in one set of hands, is an institutional definition. there is also what you could call a psychological or a spiritual definition of tyranny that our great literature often puts forward. And uh, and to understand that, it would be helpful to understand the understanding of human nature, say, is presented in Aristotle or even in Genesis in the Bible or in other spiritual traditions. Um, that human beings are kind of a midpoint between the divine and the bestial. Um, we're animals, and some of us more than others. And the animal part of us is the source of our passions and our physical needs. Um, and and yet we're sometimes more than that too. Sometimes a good thought comes into our heads, or we can sense eternity on the horizon. And our different traditions, either the Bible, which of course says that we're created in the image of God, but just the image, um, uh, or the other spiritual traditions of the human race, suggest that that divine element, the part that's rational and beneficial, that's in us, but that where we are is kind of a midpoint between those two things. And in some ways, that's makes sense. I mean, much of the great tragedy and comedy of great liturgy portrays human beings aspiring to be gods, and then uh, they wake up the next day, and it just turns out that they're articulate animals with a cell phone. Um, so, in terms of the question of tyranny, you would have to say that that the great literary works that have studied tyranny, like Sophocles in Oedipus Rex or in Antigone or Shakespeare, um, suggests that what a tyrant is psychologically or spiritually is somebody who comes to believe that he or she is God and begins to treat other human beings as if they were beasts, turns them into simple instruments of power and need. And that kind of distortion of the human person in tyranny. I last year I taught a course on Harry Potter, which I love very much, and I had taught previously. And one of the reasons I like the Harry Potter series is because I think Rowling, J.K. Rowling, uh, has a very fine and complicated portrait of tyranny in Voldemort, and to which I think she actually used classical sources. So in some ways, um, to prevent tyranny means you've got to create institutions that don't allow one set of human beings or one human being to experience that absolute power that we identify with God, because only bad things will happen. And I have to say that when you look at the great tyrannies of history, um, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, etc., that generally speaking, these tyrants do assume godlike power, political power, but ultimately they become destructive and paranoid and lonely. So uh, I think there's wisdom there to be had, but let's concentrate on the institutional parts. So in the ensuing papers, Madison goes through different alternatives, like the experiments in the state constitutions that generally failed to maintain the separation of powers. They had it on paper in almost all the state constitutions, but in reality, the legislatures were voracious and unstoppable in terms of controlling the other institutions of government. And he details their failure over the essays. And so in Federalist 51, he says, well, what can we do? What finally can we do to stop that concentration of power that everyone defines as tyranny? He lays out the argument. He says the solution has to include both means and motives. The means part. By that he means that the institutions have to be separated. That's the separation of powers, obviously. But they also have to have the power to defend themselves against the other branches. And this part of the argument is what has come to be called checks and balances. So the full theory presented in Federalist 51 is separation of powers and checks and balances. Now, it's a little ironic because if you look at most of the checks and balances in the Constitution, such as the veto power of the president or judicial review, um, the checks actually blend a little power from another department and give it to the another branch. Not so much that it destroys the overall separation, but enough that it gives to the other branch the power to defend itself from the attempts to be taken over. So, for instance, the veto power. If you think about it, to veto a law, to say no to a law, means an exercise of legislative power. But isn't that the business of the legislature? Yes. And that's why the Congress can override a president's veto. But nevertheless, the veto power is proved to be one of the most important checks and balances which the president has in the constitutional system. And of course, that's true of all the other. The fact that the Senate, for instance, ratifies appointments both to the judiciary and to the executive branch. So, so again, the main idea here is you have to give to each branch the means, the tools to resist the inappropriate attempts at power of the other branches. Now, this lays open the second part of the argument, motives. Madison knows what his reader is thinking. He says, I know what you're thinking. He doesn't say that. He says, it may be a reflection on human nature that such devices are necessary to keep good government. And what he means by that is this. We're going to find out that when he says the necessary motives have to be given to each branch, that you have to identify, that you have to have the office holders identify their self-interest with the duties of the office. So as you're going to see, I'm tipping you off as to the view of human nature here. It relies upon an explicit embrace of self-interest. And now note, by the way, Madison doesn't think that politicians should be criminals and etc. There's a limit to self-interest. A thief is self-interested, and so is a business person. But they operate clearly differently. And you'll see that here in this essay and in Federalist 10, Madison is convinced that self-interest is probably the most present, strong, and reliable energy in human beings. It's not the only energy in human beings, but in terms of building a government, it's probably the most reliable foundation. Better to assume that the people in power are out for themselves and work with it, as you'll see, rather than to assume that they're angels. In fact, this is one of the most famous parts of the entire Federalist Papers, because Madison knows that this seems to be a low view of human beings. And he says, it may be a reflection on human beings or human nature that such devices are necessary. But what is government but the greatest of all reflections of human nature? And here it comes. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were available to govern men, then such devices or auxiliary protections wouldn't be necessary. But in a government to be administered by human beings over human beings, first you've got to get the government to control the governed, and then you've got to get the government to control itself. Madison's point is you've got to take humanity, human beings, as they are. You can't found your government upon a wishful view of human beings. And we'll see exactly what he means by this here. So the overall argument in Federalist 51 is, if you want the government to be constructed so that in its very structure and operations, it prevents that concentration of powers, you have to give to each branch the means, checks and balances, and the motives, the self-interest to restrain or resist the other branches. He expresses this in a pungent and concentrated sentence that occurs in the body of the essay, and that I'll quote it, and then I'll have to retranslate it because some of the words have shifted meaning, and explain what it means in common sense English. So you could say, here's the sentence: this policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests the defect of better motives. So this policy of the Constitution to prevent tyranny is by making up for, here, let me translate it for you. So the word supplying here doesn't mean to provide something. It means to make up for the lack of. And in the last part of that sentence, the defect of better motives, the word defect here means lack. So let me retranslate this phrase, rearranging it and putting it into contemporary language. The policy of the Constitution is to make up for the lack of better motives in the people that hold office by setting up opposite and rival interests. So that Madison doesn't deny, by the way, that people have good impulses, and even politicians even if most of them make you want to wash your hands after you shake hands with them. Most politicians are decent people, but when push comes to shove in the exercise of power, um, don't expect them to be Mother Teresa or my mother, both remarkable saints. Um, expect them to be human beings, which is to say self-interest, and then rely on that interest, channel that interest, and by keeping the opposite and rival interests of the branches separated and balanced, that checking and balancing, that ambition resisting ambition is what will keep the whole system in balance. It isn't pretty, as we saw this last year. Um, oftentimes, our institutions get involved in interesting personal and institutional squabbles. We saw that with President Trump in the House over the impeachment issue. But you have to see the system was planned for that. It's that tension, that messiness, which is sometimes unpleasant to look at, but nevertheless is effective in keeping the institutions of government restrained. So, in essence, the policy is to use human selfishness to control human selfishness. Because what is tyranny? It's when the human self overrides everything else and becomes a monster in the name of a god. So you use the energy of self-interest to control self-interest. That's Federalist 51. Now, in Federalist 10, as I mentioned, the problem is deeper and more profound. So, and this, to understand the argument that Madison makes here, go back to something that I said in my last lecture, that the Constitution is constructed by the framers, had three great institutional novelties that had never been attempted before in human history. The new federalism, the balance between the national government and the semi-sovereign states, which we'll turn to later. The presidency, a truly strong and vigorous executive, and as we'll see, Federalist 51 applies here, but is restrained by the balance of institutions in the Constitution and also by popular vote. More about that when we turn to the presidency. The other great novelty was the large republic. As I said on Wednesday, all previous forms of popular government, government that operates, that is rooted in the will of the people and operates in some ways by the will of the people, they had always been small in scale, territory, and population. And the kind of dogma of political thinking was they had to be small, because once you got to a huge country, you had to resort to administrative centralization and an extension of power like the Roman Empire to keep things together. The Constitution, for the first time, sets up a huge, and it's a pretty huge republic now, 330 million people from coast to coast and more and beyond. So in this essay, you'll see Madison is not only describing, because understand that a good portion of his American audience at that time would have said, a huge republic, it's not possible. If you try to make a huge republic, it will fail. It will cease to be a republic. Madison is going to argue it's possible. And as you'll see, he's going to argue it's better. Better than what? Better than the small republics of the states and every previous small republic. And as you'll see, especially better than democracy. Now, the framers, the best way to understand this, as Diamond says in his essays, the framers didn't reject democracy. They had to put the Constitution on a popular basis. But the Constitution is not democratic. And what we'll see in this essay is now the framers' specific definition. We use the term democratic very loosely today to cover any government that is operated or grounded in popular will, the will of the people. As you're going to see, there are different ways to do that. I'm going to try to organize the argument into genus and species if you've had biology. The genus is the class of a being, and the species is the particular thing. You know, like human beings are part of the class, the genus of primates that include orangutans, chimpanzees, and my department chair. But we are Homo sapiens. We're a certain species or kind of primate. You'll see that the framers, that Madison in this essay constructs the genus of popular government and then divides it into species, democracies and republics, and then suggests a new species is coming into being, the large republic. Let's see how he does this. He says that a strong union will help to address the problem of faction. And by faction, his formal definition, which you should memorize, is a number of citizens, whether a majority or minority, activated by a common impulse of a passion, interest, or opinion, adverse or opposite to the rights of others and to the common good. Now, why don't we just educate faction away? Why don't we, as Marx suggests, reconstitute the economy so that the society becomes factionless? As you're going to see, Madison says that's just not possible. Faction is an element of human society, in every society, whether it's hidden or not, because it's there in human nature. We'll see how he finds that. So he particularly says that democracies and republics have had a tendency to fall apart because they are torn apart by factions, which would make sense if you're living under an executive tyranny or a dictator like Saddam Hussein or my department chair. Just kidding. Then you could say the authority of the dictator restrains society and keeps factions subdued. Take away that dictator, on the other hand, and oftentimes the factions explode. So Madison says factions are always there in society, and in a democracy or republic, a popular government, they become especially destructive because they can operate freely. So let's get into his argument. This is particularly a problem of popular government, of government of the people. So Madison says that you can either deal with faction in one of two ways. You can eliminate the causes, or you can cure the effects. Now, to eliminate the causes, Madison says, you'd either have to give everybody the same interest, the same passion, the same opinion, or take away liberty. He has a great phrase: liberty is to faction as oxygen is to flames. And he's right. Those actually tend to be the same thing. Have there been governments and societies that have tried to do that, to give everyone the same interest, the same opinion, the same passion? Yes. They become totalitarian and try to regulate and control every aspect of human life. So Madison says you can't do it. You can't eliminate faction. And his great phrase is, the causes of faction are latent in human nature. They're buried in our human nature. Why? What causes, what is in our nature? Well, first of all, we have physical bodies that mean we're interested in our own existence at times, acutely so. We have difference of opinions, different degrees of rationality. We are moved by the passions. So only if you could somehow, by divine power, and most of the theological traditions of humanity say that in the final redemption that'll happen, but to fix human nature, it requires divine miracles. So give up the idea of eliminating the cause of faction, because you will have to change human nature. What about controlling the effects? He says, well, that depends on whether the faction is a majority or a minority. If a faction is a minority, construct the government so that, broadly speaking, the will of the majority predominates. You have popular elections, etc. Now, we'll see there are many critiques of American politics that suggest that sometimes powerful minorities may exercise more control than their number would suggest. But generally speaking, if you have a majoritarian government, the majority will outweigh the effects of the minority. So then we're left to the core of the argument. What to do then if you have a system in which the majority is the faction? The faction is the majority. And that's where Madison gets into the core of his argument. As I said, he creates the genus or the class of popular governments. These are governments that operate through and by the will of the people. And he says, in turn, there are two species, democracies and republics. It may help as a mnemonic, as a way of remembering this, to say that democracies, what is a democracy? Where the people rule directly, like ancient Athens, where actually they ran the government, they ran the court system, they did everything. The people ruled directly, direct democracy. A republic is where the people rule indirectly through representative, republic representative. Why is representation good? because it turns out that a passion can overcome the people. The people, especially if they're majority, may become tyrannical towards a minority. Have we ever had that problem before? And so if you have representatives, the will of the people goes through a filter. He says that the will of the people is refined, because what happens in a republic when you choose representatives is the people give a sense of what the country needs to the representatives, and then the representatives actually form policy. So just having a representative form of government is an improvement on the raw elements of public opinion, which, if you followed Twitter ever since it arose, you can see that public opinion can have some ugly, transient, and some terrible dimensions to it. And don't forget, Adolf Hitler was elected popularly by the Weimar Constitution. Just because the majority rules, a lynch mob is a democratic phenomenon, but a lynch mob is an ugly thing because there's no reason or law there. So, if so, in general, a republic will be preferable to a democracy because there's this refining and restraining element. Now, so what about the Constitution in the large republic it sets up? In a way, he's saying, okay, now within this species of republic, there can be two subspecies, small republics and large republics. Now, be clear, there never has been a large republic. The Constitution, the proposed Constitution, is the first one in human history. Why would that be better from the standpoint of restraining democratic and majoritarian tyranny? Because, here it comes, if you expand the size and population of the country, the number of factions will also expand. This is a very subtle argument. If you expand the number of factions, then you will decrease the possibility that any one of them will become a majority or a persistent and tyrannical majority. So here's the core argument. If you increase the size of the republic, as the Constitution has done, a larger population, larger territory, the population will be so diverse. There will be many factions, many religious factions, many economic factions, many different factions of opinion. But it's the very number of factions then that begins to restrain the power of faction. This is a subtler and larger view that we saw in Federalist 51. If you can't get rid of the energy of self-interest, then use that energy to control self-interest. And what Madison is suggesting here is, like, take religious freedom. In countries where there's only one or two religious groups, you often see religious persecution because one of the religious groups gets into power and tries to use governmental power to restrain or eliminate the other, the minority. But in America, where it's true, 80% of the people are Christians, but it's numbered that there are probably several thousand religious sects, mostly Protestant. But it's that very number of religious denominations that actually is the security to the practice of religion. So, and that's the great argument in Federalist 10. The Constitution presents, for the first time, a huge and diverse republic that embraces so much diversity that it restrains the energies of a tyrannical potential majority. Now, not always. As we saw, a powerful majority can get a hold of local institutions or even the national institutions for a time, but nevertheless, this is one of the securities. So let me summarize. In both 10 and 51, the argument is that these great political evils of faction and tyranny come from and are rooted in human nature, human selfishness. The Constitution and the framers don't look away from that energy, they look towards it and try to embrace it. Here's the main point. In affirming moderate self-interest as the basis of society and government, the framers rejected, as I said earlier, utopianism, the attempt to perfect governments and society and human beings by applying some abstract standard, whether it's brotherhood or equality or socialism, and have concentrated on what might one expect from most human beings most of the time if their energies are properly channeled. There you have the core theory of the United States Constitution. Turn to human nature. See its core tendencies. Give those tendencies free scope, yet restrain them and channel them through a complicated system of separated institutions with checks and balances, and a large and diverse republic. I would say that in general, the expectations of the founders has been borne out. It has led to the most stable, prosperous, and free population that the human race has ever known. On Monday, we'll turn to the question of race.